spookiest month, October. Prepare yourself for episodes that frighten and delight in your spine as we chill you to the bone. You can find us on YouTube and at Terror in Tandem, on Instagram at Terror in Tandem, and you'll always find our latest episode on our website, terrorintandem.com.
Well done.
We're wrapping it up, people.
It's finally happening.
We want to just do a little housekeeping. Just
It's a little
briefly.
dusty in here.
Well, it is, because there's been lots of national gas grid construction and digging new gas lines.
Not to mention the 2 years long construction project that's already been going on.
Yeah, at a banking system.
Yes.
So we're surrounded by construction, and you may have noticed there was one episode that we didn't do last week, but we did give you a bonus episode. So you may hear a little background noise. We're doing our best, people, and you're going to have a bonus episode for Halloween this week.
Now, normally we would just hop to another luxury property that is a little bit less expensive, but family is keeping us in the area this year.
Yeah, we have a lot of irons in the fire.
Lots
over
going
here.
on. Really, it's rude that you would ask.
We got to keep our ears to the ground where we're planted right now,
and our noses to the grindstone.
Yeah, we're maybe on a no-fly list or a border checklist.
Maybe we've been asked to leave multiple flights.
Maybe we have lost our luxury properties to gambling debts in Vegas.
This is terrible. Dark. Just kidding. We're still filthy rich people.
Well,
anyway.
you can watch that, the Rise and Fall of Terror in Tandem's documentary.
It's actually just called The and Fall.
The
existence and fall.
the ego platitudes of Terror and Tandem, and the reality check slap in the face in the poorhouse.
Oh, alms for the poor.
That's the extended title.
I hope in my poor elder years to receive alms.
Oh, yeah, so many alms.
Well, speaking of alms, what are we doing today?
We're talking about horror documentaries,
Absolutely.
of which we will soon be the subject, either murder-suicide or
suicide
murder-spree or
suicide resurrection murder.
Catricide.
Oh, God, yeah. Cat human murder.
No, I meant catricide, where we kill our cat.
She can't be killed.
That's what she thinks. We're not going to kill our cat.
Yeah, before you even start. We would run into a burning building for this monster.
Yeah. And we did, and that's why we have to record from this terrible property.
And the worst part was she started the fucking fire. God.
She's such a jerk.
Cats.
But we love her.
So much.
She's our familiar.
The best.
Live. Yet we don't even really know her.
Good one. So speaking of cats, let's talk about documentaries.
Sure.
We are now co-host. I don't watch a lot of documentaries, as you know.
You don't.
It is my least watched genre after maybe rom-coms. I don't read a lot of nonfiction outside of essays and long-form news and stuff like that. I just I don't really read a lot of biographies and things like that. I'm a narrative fiction kind of cat.
And fantasy.
I like to live in the fantasy because real world is real enough for me. Thank you. But there are some really, really special horror documentaries. And we kind of did a little mix here.
Yeah, we're changing it up.
At least I did. In terms of my selections are... It's both documentaries that are about horror and documentaries that are about other subjects, but they're so horrifying, they leave an impression on you that is really no different than an amazing horror film.
Well, we are changing it up a little bit in our presentation.
We are.
Instead, we're not going to be you do one and I do one. We're actually going to talk about 3 shared documentaries.
Tag team.
And then we're each going to throw in an additional
documentary. We're going to throw in so many things.
That
but all of them
solo watched.
Not only are these based on a true story, these are true stories.
Yeah, they are.
Happened.
We definitely avoided true crime.
Yeah, listen, this isn't... We're not going to be talking about, Chris Marker's Night and Fog. We're not talking about a horror documentary that is an examination of like a massive human tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, one of them is.
Yes, but we're not like talking about genocide.
No.
or something like that. These are a little smaller in scale than that, and we really did try not to be exploitative.
Instead of talking about what we're going to talk about, let's just get into talking about it.
That's a great idea, and I'd love to discuss it for 20 more minutes.
The first one we're going to talk about is tagged as a crime documentary.
Mm-hmm.
And it is probably one of the saddest.
Oh God, no! You're starting with this one?
It was the first one on my list that came out.
Boop.
So it's probably one of the saddest. And when I was like making notes for it, I got very emotional. So it's Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father.
So I'll take over here for a second while my co-host gets the dust out of her eyes. Dear Zachary is a documentary that you and I watched together, I think, on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
Because this documentary is really two documentaries. It starts off already something quite sad. It's a guy whose best friend has died, and he is filming a documentary of his life for his newborn son, Zachary. And it's going to be, for when Zachary gets a little bit older, he can watch this footage of his dad as put together by his friend.
Can we back up 1 second?
Sure.
It came out in 2008, and I think we watched it probably at Christmas of 2008 or 9.
Yep.
And it was written, directed.
Our first year living together. Our
Yes.
first Christmas together. And this is how we spent it, folks.
Well, it was our first Christmas in LA
Yeah.
together. We were sort of solo. We were just getting settled. We hadn't really met lots of people.
Just a couple
of
of kids.
people in LA, they're transient, so they go home or spend Christmas with their families.
It can be a little lonely sometimes.
Yeah, so we decided to pop this old doc on, and boy, was it a horrible afternoon.
It was only slightly less funny than Christmas Shoes.
But it was written, directed, and starring Kurt Kuhn, or Cooney. That's the subject of this documentary, his best friend. So he finds out that his friend Andrew Bagby has been murdered by his accused ex-girlfriend, who's pregnant with Andrew's child. So he starts to film this documentary, as Richard said, as a tribute to his best friend, about his best friend, from people who knew and loved him. And he really wanted to give this as a love letter, as a this is who knew your dad, to the unborn child, now then to be named Zachary.
It's like that
when
movie
he was born.
from the 90s with Michael Keaton where he's dying of cancer, so he makes a bunch of movies for his unborn son.
He wanted his son, he wanted Zachary to know his best friend Andrew, his dad,
a lovely notion,
as who he was and how he was represented in the world with the friendships and love that he left behind, which that started out as the documentary. And it was quite lovely, and
it was very touching, but that's life. And then something happens, and it's not fair to call it a twist because this is a real thing that really happened. And do you want to go into it? Yeah.
So the ex escapes essentially.
This is
Canada.
while this man is filming his documentary. Yeah. This occurs.
The ex-girlfriend escapes to Canada. She then has the baby, and Andrew's parents, Zachary's grandparents, start to get involved in a really desperate, and unlike I've ever seen grandparents, they're
like vigilante.
Yeah. They just wouldn't. They were relentless in their need to just have visitation. Yeah. To be part of baby Zachary's life.
This trial was like, she was suspected of his murder. Like she left the country, so it was very wrapped up in like legal extradition and things like that. So she hadn't gone to trial yet. So it was all in this very murky gray area, and she was definitely like delaying things.
And while the grandparents were sort of like, yeah, she's accused of killing our son, but we really just want visitation with Zachary. We'll take what we can get. They really wanted custody, but it was really difficult because of her move to Canada, because of the extradition.
And they were forced to spend time with the woman who murdered their son.
Yeah. And the Canadian legal system. So then this is where the documentary starts to fracture into multiple atrocities, I would say.
Yeah, no, this is...
The Canadian legal system at this time and its failure to ultimately protect Zachary is where this heartbreak of this documentary really hits deeply.
While they're in the middle of this legal morass, this awful woman kills herself and takes Zachary with her.
Yes, she strapped Zachary to her chest and jumped into the Atlantic.
So this was...
Freezing cold Atlantic.
Now, the reason that we're talking about this on a horror documentary is because there is no hint or clue of this happening.
No.
You are watching this documentary that is very sad and touching, and then it becomes complicated.
Yeah, then it's a legal
then
battle.
It becomes,
you're like, I want the grandparents to have custody of this kid.
It becomes very frustrating as well, and you start to really... Whereas you started out, and really all you're doing is watching this love letter to, the Zachary... then you start to take sides because now there are sides to be taken and things are happening. So you really, really start to identify with the grandparents and with the best friend, and you start to really villainize the mom because, God, she's the worst.
And also the Canadian legal system.
Yes. And, and then
because
the horror of it.
There were judges that said, no, we don't see her as a threat. We're going to let her.
She very much escaped any sort of legal or consideration because, let's face it, she was a white woman and she was being accused by, men.
And she was being accused in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And now she was in Canada, which...
And a lot of countries are very hesitant to extradite people, even those with treaties with us, because we, unlike a lot of countries in the world, still have a federal death penalty. So in many cases, other countries would be like, well, are you going to kill this person if we send them back to you? We're not really, that's not what we do. So they may be hesitant to. Anyway, the horror of this really comes from the fact that you're utterly blindsided. Mm-hmm. You're right in the room as all of this is happening. You learn as the filmmakers and the subjects themselves learn. And then you witness true grief and rage and confusion.
Injustice.
It's injustice, and it brings all of the anger of injustice. But from a documentary filmmaking point of view, the way this is brought, the way he brings the audience along with himself on the journey with the family, it eliminates the barrier between viewer and subject. Now you're in the room with these grieving, horrified parents who are feeling so much emotion that nobody really even knows what to do with it or call it. And you're right there with them. And I've never been so annihilated by a documentary in my life. I was ruined.
I mean, it starts with a murder and ends with a murder that you never saw coming. And the director had to decide whether or not he was actually going to continue making this once things started to take a turn. Because it became about a crime documentary rather than a love letter to Zachary, who once he was killed, what do you do? What do you do as a filmmaker?
I mean, it's an extraordinary act of love, service, and will to finish this. I mean, it was the only justice anybody was going to get, was that this story was told and that we all know about it now. This is quite a famous and well-known documentary.
But at some point the filmmaker shifted into really exposing the brutal murder of Andrew. So it really talked about how he was murdered, how it could only be the ex-girlfriend, how all of the clues and evidence was pointing to her. So it really exposed that brutality and that rage murder. And then it focused on the murder-suicide of herself and Zachary and that brutality and just escaping justice. Now, so there was no justice for Andrew, no justice for Zachary.
Now, what separates this reason we're talking about this on a horror podcast is I know that this sounds a lot just, like Dateline or any number of murder porn horror shows, whatever. But this, like I said, is different in that it's not a voyeuristic element to this film. You really are brought into it, and you may not want to. Honestly, there were times where I was like, I don't want to know all of this. I don't want to see all of this, and that's the thing about this documentary and about a gripping documentary is, well, you signed up. These people didn't want to see this either, but that is where you are. You are a part of this. It's sort of a pact that you sign at the beginning of the movie, but with this movie, you didn't sign that pact because it was really not advertised what was going on.
No, I mean, it was laid out like a horror film. It was laid out like a mystery that needed to be solved.
Absolutely.
And it had a terrible,
and it has the
twist ending.
And just on how it affected me emotionally and psychologically, and for how long it affected me, and this many years later, the emotions it still brings out in us. It's hard to recommend this as a good time watch, but it is one of the better and more lasting documentaries I've ever seen.
Yeah.
In a genre that's pretty crowded.
It is identified in the horror documentary genre. It is very hard to watch. It's a very, very hard watch. I won't ever watch it again. I have a hard time recommending this to people, but really it is amazing filmmaking as well. And the outcome, you can say, maybe had some positivity. The filmmaker worked with Andrew's family to help change the laws in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, anytime there's a law with someone's name on it, it's probably a murdered child. So,
yeah.
Yay, law. Great. Well, that's Dear Zachary, everybody. So, what's our next one?
Cropsey.
2009, coming from Joshua Zeman and Barbara Brancaccio.
Yes, those are New Yorker names if I ever heard them.
Oh, Barbara Brancaccio.
Yeah.
Hey, how's your sister? Absolutely. And not only New York, this is specifically from one of the weirdest parts of New York, a part of New York that even people who live in New York often don't know a whole lot about. And yes, I'm talking Staten Island, folks.
Yeah,
that
it's
weird
Staten Island
place that's really hard to get to, that is on the way to nowhere. It doesn't have anything, doesn't look like any other borough, and is super duper right wing.
This documentary talks about a little bit about the urban legend of Cropsey and the actual events surrounding this sort of urban legend mystique of Cropsey. So I thought I would tell a little about the urban legend of Cropsey.
Go for it.
So growing up, these documentarians heard of this urban legend, as many people in their neighborhoods did.
As somebody who is from New York, I heard about Cropsey.
Yeah. So Cropsey is a legend about George Cropsey, who is a man who goes insane after losing his family from a fire that was caused by campers near Maston Lake. He disappears, and then he comes back allegedly to seek revenge on these campers. If this sounds familiar, like Friday the 13th, I feel like, I don't know if this was influenced or an influence of Jason's.
I can do you one better. The 1981 slasher, The Burning, the killer in that movie's name was Cropsey.
Yeah.
So yes.
So he seeks revenge on these campers, leading to all these murders that are unsolved. And so this urban legend started to grow and evolved in him taking, escaping from Willowbrook Mental Institution, armed with an axe, ready to kidnap and kill children. So that went on for decades.
And let me assure you folks, Staten Island is already pretty scary. It doesn't need a serial killer. I mean, it's got an abandoned mental institution that is like from the bad old days, mass graves, and yeah, it's just
lots of undrinkable
and Pete Davidson
water. So the documentary itself,
also Method Man, like sorry Method. I don't mean to talk shit about Staten Island.
The documentary itself does like dive into the urban legend a bit, but what's really interesting about this is a man named Andre Rand, decided to like embody this legend of Cropsey.
Yep.
Seemingly. In 1983, he took a bus full of children from a New York City YMCA to the Newark International Airport. None of the kids were hurt, but he was sentenced to jail. And then a couple of years later, he kidnapped and killed a 13-year-old girl, Jennifer, with Down syndrome. And she was, found out that he murdered her and murdered other kids as well. So they sort of said, this Andre Rand, is he Cropsey? Has he always been Cropsey? It leads you to believe that he is, but it's really not.
No, it's definitely not, because he starts his murder spree like 10 years after Cropsey stories started. Cropsey stories started popping up in New York in like the late 60s, early 70s.
Yes.
I heard that shit in the 80s.
Like 20 years. Yeah, well,
so
that's what happened.
Well,
The
The Burning was written by the Weinstein brothers, who are from New York.
Which Andre Rand must have seen that or been inspired by
something. Like it I think he for sure took on the moniker. 'Cause Cropsey at that time was just some shit that parents said, like, come home before it gets too dark out or Cropsey will get you. Yeah, it was like, it was how boomers raised kids and called it parenting. But yeah, this guy Andre Rand did, in the documentary they do conflate it a little bit. And
they talk about all the missing kids.
Yeah.
And that it could have been because he was a janitor, I think, or a custodian or something.
It's much more likely that there is no Cropsey, just that Staten Island had a couple of weirdos and, like I said, a massive mental institution that was then like abandoned after it was discovered they had graves and they were, like abusing people.
Well, this is the slippery. Documentaries can have a slippery slope. That was really hard for me to say, everyone.
You said it perfectly the first time, though.
Yeah, I know. I took my time because they can lay out the story. And I do think that this is what these documentarians did.
They
lay out the story.
I remember watching this with you.
Yeah, to make you think that Andre Rand is Cropsey. And they give you the evidence they have collected to further their case.
So,
but also never saying we 100% know and believe that Andre Rand is Cropsey.
They also spend a good deal of time themselves, the filmmakers, on camera.
Yes.
Which I have never... It's rare that I enjoy a thing like that. I usually prefer when unless you're Werner Herzog, honestly, don't put yourself in your own documentary. Just tell the story. Unless it's about you. In this case, I couldn't see a reason for the filmmakers to have inserted themselves so prominently.
Well, they were talking about their childhood on Staten Island and then how they were led to believe these urban legends. Then it started happening.
I think would have been more interesting if that had just been their inspiration to do it and then they interviewed other people from Staten Island. What we ended up with Cropsey was a good deal about the filmmakers themselves, and then what ended up kind of being along the lines of Oliver Stone's JFK, when at the end of it, you're like, okay, I think what I just watched was your theory on this. It was less of a documentary and more of like a video essay.
And I think it's more, and from the evidence and watching and reading the urban legend and everything, it seems that Andre Rand was inspired by the urban legend of Cropsey, which he likely grew up hearing about too.
Absolutely.
And took advantage of it.
For sure.
Maybe he wasn't even smart enough to take advantage of it, and he was just a psycho that wanted to kill young girls.
Yeah. Kids. It does seem like Andre Rand may have taken advantage of this came a couple of years before the Satanic Panic really kicked off in New York. And New York was especially Long Island was like fucking ground zero for that nonsense.
But if you think about any killer or dormant killer, when there is somebody on the hunt, maybe like somebody is killing women, right? And they have a certain MO, and you hear about it in the newspaper, and you're a dormant killer, and you do the same methodology, like a copycat.
Are you talking about
to get away with it?
Like the movie Copycat with Sigourney Weaver?
No, I wasn't talking about that. I was just
Actually,
talking about
good movie.
the copycatting of crimes.
Yeah, like
Is
in
that
the movie
one with
Copycat.
Cillian Murphy too?
No, he was like 10 years old when that movie came out.
I don't know.
No, maybe not 10 years old. I think I was maybe 10 years old when the fucking movie came out.
Yeah, I think he's like probably was 20. She wasn't that college professor. Or was that her? She was like a psychologist writer.
I saw this movie once in the 90s when it came out. You're like really putting me on the stand. It was Holly Hunter was in it. It was Copycat Killers. Okay. And it was called Copycat.
Well, anyway, I do think sometimes people take advantage of these types of stories to get away with things.
Much like the film Copycat.
Yeah, the film you know nothing about, but have brought up multiple times.
It's one of my favorites.
You keep copying catting.
That's amazing. I mean, look, Holly Hunter is great, and so is Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah, she is. Ripley, believe it or not.
So, now all of that being said, it's a well shot documentary. It's interesting. Staten Island. I know I ripped on it a lot because I'm from Brooklyn. It's what we do. But it is a fascinating place, especially like if you don't know anything about Staten Island, but you just sort of know like Manhattan, it blows your mind. It's not like the Bronx. It's not like Brooklyn. It's like
very hilly. And
a lot of trees, parks,
think that.
Suburbs. I mean, but it has a dark past. It was where a lot of victims of the flu pandemic of the early 20th century were buried in mass graves.
And then the mental institution.
There was a mental institution, which was, I believe that was the one that Geraldo Rivera did the expose on.
Yes, he did. Maybe. I think so. That's exactly the place.
Yeah, Willowbrook Asylum. That was the one that it shut down because fucking Geraldo Rivera went and showed people like covered in excrement. Yeah. Remember when Geraldo was a journalist who did things? And then he did the whole Al Capone's vault thing. That was pretty funny. That
was a real disappointment.
Check first. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a camera. You can turn it off. So anyway, boy, we're 100 years old. So yeah, Willowbrook State.
People are like Googling
Geraldo.
Yeah.
But
don't.
It's a fascinating place. It's not like any other place in New York. Its people are different than other New Yorkers. They just politically, culturally, socially, they're Staten Island. It's different.
And I think that probably applies to all the boroughs.
It absolutely does. Every borough has its own flavor, but I don't know. There is just none so much as Staten Island. It really does stand out. And to have this take place in a unique location like that, it really gives you a sense of a part of New York that isn't often discussed. I feel like everybody's heard of Staten Island, but not a lot of people know about it. And even people who live in New York rarely go there because it's not easy to get to. You got to take the ferry or go over the Verrazzano. It's expensive.
Mm-hmm. Except the ferry's not.
Yeah, but like if you're on the way to Jersey, you can cut through, but it's like not worth it. It's really, you go to Staten Island to get to Staten Island.
Yeah. And that's maybe why this is such a, it's like isolating.
It is. It is an insular community. Yes, exactly. And that, especially back in the day, that's why things
it's
like
Cropsey. It's not like a commuter borough.
Yeah. Like I heard about Cropsey, but I heard about it because I had family in New York.
Yeah.
Like Cropsey wasn't like a Brooklyn or a Nassau County thing. It was just like a New York thing. You heard about it. But in Staten Island, if you grew up there, it was a very real urban legend that like everyone talked about.
Yep, for sure.
But the documentary, like I said,
it's
mixed results on its conclusion, but it is well shot and it's well, it makes good use of the
and the impact of the urban legend on the Staten Island community.
Generational damage that it did. Yeah, but it explores the space very well, I think. So that's Cropsey for you. And also, damn, Cropsey. That's just a fucking great name. What else could Cropsey be but a child killer?
Isn't there a flower that's like a Copsy flower.
Well, there's dropsy.
That's not a good disease.
So it's not one of the good diseases.
Well,
hey, I have great news. You have a good disease.
Yeah, what's that one where your brain changes and you can play piano?
Flowers for Algernon disease. So let's take a little break and let's come back and talk about more real awful things.
Okay.
Tired of watching mom blow through your inheritance on medicine? Or have you just had it up to here with caring for the vulnerable with compassion? Well, whatever the reason, you don't need the millstone around your neck that is loved ones. But you know what else you don't need? A first-degree murder charge. And that's where Visiting Demons comes in. At Visiting Demons, our swarm of infernally trained hospice monsters will make sure the ailing breadwinner in your family meets an untimely but difficult to investigate end. Oopsie, forgot to check the chart before we gave Gam Gam her medication. Ruh-roh, looks like Uncle Moneybags fell out of the bed and out of the locked window across the room. You'll be laughing all the way to the reading of the will, secure in the knowledge that none of this will be traced back to you, because all visiting demons return to the specific plane of hell from which they were summoned upon a job well done. Sure, it causes them torment the human mind can't comprehend, but I think we've already established you don't care about things like that, am I right? Visiting Demons. Because who has time to wait for natural causes when you've got student loans to pay off? This is a fake ad for a fake product on a horror-themed podcast. We do not condone nor endorse hiring demons to murder people for money. Just let time take care of it. Oh, welcome back. Wonderful, wonderful. Let's make a documentary about death.
Or the devil.
Ooh, is that the next one?
Yeah.
What is it?
The nightmare. Are you having one right now?
No, that's the sound you make when you have sleep paralysis.
Well, sometimes.
This.
You have that.
I have heard. So I've been hearing about this movie since it came out. I don't know why I never watched. Probably just I'm just like not interested in documentaries. But boy, was I wrong. This is so good.
Yeah. The Nightmare came out in 2015, directed by Rodney Asher.
It is. I've never seen anything quite like this. It follows 8 subjects as they discuss it's a bit of a misnomer to call this a nightmare. These are not nightmares. None of these people are having nightmares. These are not what you would call nightmares. These are night terrors and sleep paralysis.
Yeah. Sleep paralysis induced hallucinations.
Yes. Night terror isn't a clinical term. It's just sort of like, I think, a catch-all for a nightmare that is more than that.
Yeah. A night terror is something that you are conscious is happening and you're screaming to get awakened.
So I know that you and I both suffer from
sleeping disorders.
Yes. So I would love for you, if you're comfortable with, to talk a little bit about your version of it, and then I will talk about mine before we get into this documentary.
Yeah, my sleep issue, I don't know why it precipitates. Based on what I learned about sleep paralysis, I have night terrors, and I will be in a sleeping state. I will be having a nightmare of some kind. Well, I don't know if it's REM sleep or like how deep. I've never been to a sleep study, so I can't with authority say.
We don't know if we're in REM stage,
or if I'm like
deep
in
sleep,
between or
balls
waking.
deep sleep.
Gross. And I will need, I will be verbalizing help. I am asking for help or screaming for help. And I become conscious that I'm having a nightmare that I can't wake from, and I need somebody to pull me out of it. And so my night terrors translate into me sometimes screaming, sometimes not making sense, sometimes just loud noising.
Sometimes thrashing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's just all in an effort to get myself out of this nightmare.
And folks, let me tell you, when you're not having a night terror and you're just deeply asleep on your own and you're woken up by the blood-curdling screams of the woman you love inches away from you, That gets the heart pumping.
Yeah. I also talk in my sleep.
Sure do.
So I think I am very on the line of consciousness and sleep.
Yeah, one time you went into a whole thing about how our dog at the time was hiding. Charlie was hiding in the walls with surveillance equipment. Seated in front of a row of cameras, like that movie Sliver, a little dog room.
Yeah, a little dog room,
and he had
off of our bedroom.
Little headset on, and he was reporting our activities.
Yeah, he was watching us sleep.
His dog masters, and he's just like, so the humans are sleeping.
Yeah, he was controlling us.
Though. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
He was putting messages into our brains.
I was able to keep you going for a little bit, and then you woke up in the middle and you were like, what are you saying?
Yeah. So I was telling him what I was dreaming about. I guess kind of borderline lucid dreaming.
Yeah. You were not quite awake, not quite asleep.
I have an interesting relationship with dreaming that I would really love to explore, except there's really no avenue to just be part of a sleep study in a way that will bring this out.
Yeah. Because
it doesn't happen necessarily when you want it to, but I have been able to go back into dreams after waking.
Well, the last sleep study I participated in, I woke up with slashes across my arm and I was holding this dusty old fedora.
Well, that's interesting that you bring up Nightmare on Elm Street because that is part of this documentary. 100%. Why don't you share with the audience your sleep issues?
I have had this my whole life. It was pretty bad in college. It hasn't happened to me in a little while, but it does happen. So I have sleep paralysis, where what happens to me is my eyes are open and I can see the room, but I can't move. And at the end of the room, there is a dark figure. It's, humanoid, but I can't see any features, just like a shadow man. And he's just standing there. And he's not touching me, but I know that he is the one holding me captive. I can't move anything but my eyes. I can only see. The only way out, and the only thing I know is the only way out is to scream, but I can't.
He makes ghost sounds.
So in the dream, and there's a guy in the nightmare that has this exact thing, and the way he described it gave me damn near gave me an anxiety attack. So I can't move. I'm paralyzed. It's like someone has injected me with a paralytic, and all I can do is move my eyes. So I have to scream, but I can't. So it's hard to describe. I force all of my will and energy, and it is so hard to do. It's fucking crazy.
You're talking about the tweaker, right?
Yeah, and all I can ever get out is this. Like that.
But this is what it sounds like.
Yeah. So who doesn't fucking love hearing that in the middle of the night, right?
Listen, why don't you invite us to stay in your guest room?
The worst.
We are very quiet sleepers.
Yeah, funny thing is it when I was in college, it freaked the fuck out of my roommate.
Oh, me too.
Which is great because he was a piece of shit. But it used to freak him out pretty good. But
my freshman roommate in college also talked in her sleep, and who knows what kinds of things we got up to.
Oh, you could have had full-on conversations. Yeah. But the sleep paralysis is so alarming when you finally come out of it, because sometimes you slip right back into it.
Yeah.
If you are not here, actually, it's gotten a lot better since we have started cohabitating since a few weeks ago, because having someone wake you up is you feel profoundly grateful.
Yeah.
Because when I lived alone, or when I was alone, sometimes you don't really wake up all the way, so you'll put all of your will and effort, and it's like reaching for that vine off the cliff so you don't fall, and you finally grab it, and then you fall right back asleep. So but not asleep, into the same paralysis. You have to do it 4 or 5 times to get out. And I remember sometimes looking at the clock and being like, 2 hours have gone by since I first started this weird cycle of trying to wake up.
It's interesting that you say that. So here are some facts about sleep paralysis. So it affects more than 3 million people a year.
Not a lot.
It is sometimes an issue for people who have sleep apnea or narcolepsy. Episodes usually last
What?
1 to 2 minutes. So perception of time, and I'll talk about this when we talk more about the documentary, is really interesting. There's a painting by Swiss artist Henry Fuseli called The Nightmare that really depicts what some of the participants in this documentary say they saw. And it's from hundreds of years ago. It's really quite interesting to view. But this documentary is laid out like a horror film.
Like I said, okay, so now that we've put ourselves in the documentary a little bit, back to The Nightmare 2015, this thing is the most like a movie of any documentary I've ever seen. It does have interviews with the subjects, but I don't want to use the word reenactment because that sounds cheesy, because what they do is more like a production of the nightmare.
Yeah, they represent it visually.
But with
high tech.
Really well and very artistically in a very horror movie way. So using the uncanny valley, using sound cues and filters to portray this with the intent of frightening you. It's not necessarily a straight, documentary of like, we're just presenting this evidence. Not a lot of documentaries are like that. They usually have an intent and a way they're trying to make you feel. But this one very much is trying to scare you. And it is on its own legit a fucking scary movie.
I think there were like 7 or 8 people.
8. And
they all explain their inability to move, speak, that they have feelings of tingling or numbness as they're starting to fall asleep.
There were some similarities, but I was blown away at how different all of their experiences were.
Like how the representation of those visuals they are seeing.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are shadows. Sometimes there are 3 different things.
Sometimes it was religious. Sometimes it was not.
It was outer space.
Really just depends on the filter your brain is putting it through.
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be alien. Like, listen, I don't mean to downplay anything, but pretty much all alien abduction stories are just someone having sleep paralysis.
Yeah. That alien abduction story that one person interviewed told when he actually made that mask for a Halloween. It was so, Whitley
Strieber made an entire fucking career out of it. So
I will say that, these are hallucinations that people are having because they're in this sleep paralysis state. And what is most interesting in the documentary to me was that they're all reflecting back on it. It didn't seem like anybody was in the mode of sleep paralysis.
And there was I appreciated that, and I didn't really notice it until after the fact, was you're totally free to enjoy yourself in this documentary because none of these people are like ruined by this experience. No. They're not damaged. They're not like, and this ended my marriage and now I'm on drugs. Like you can just, it's not an easy experience, but it's in terms of like after watching something like Dear Zachary, this is relatively low stakes.
And some people found their way to therapy. Some people found their way to religion. But I would say one of the common threads for a lot of these people experiencing sleep paralysis was they had a very unsafe or tumultuous home life.
Your instances of night terrors were greatly increased when we lived in an area of Los Angeles County that frequently had police helicopter activity, which is all of Los Angeles County.
My nightmares did involve someone breaking into our home.
Yeah, here's the thing. When you buy a bunch of helicopters for the cops, whether or not they need to use it, they're going to use it all the time.
And you hear it, and the spotlights are in your
yard. So Laura would hear this
window.
as she was asleep. And, the light sometimes shines in your window. And I think you
can hear them on the speaker.
When you were in a certain stage of sleep, your mind is very susceptible to that. And I think it kind of colored your dream. Like when you take a nap and you're watching TV and suddenly your dream starts to act like what's happening because you're not really fully asleep.
So I think a lot of the traumas and like lack of safety probably added a layer of stress, a feeling that you couldn't fully relax and fall asleep. You know, maybe your like mind is on guard, but your body is really starting to fall asleep.
This phenomenon is not super well understood. It only affects 3 million. Is that 3 million people in the United States?
Each year.
Which is not a lot.
It didn't say U.S.
That's still, even if it was only the United States, it's not a lot. If it's only in the world, then that is a tiny drop in the bucket. So it's a rare occurrence. But I think we've all heard the term sleep paralysis or night terrors. You don't need to know anything about it. It's a little strange that the two of us have experienced it throughout our lives, because watching this documentary was both very, it was very real for me in that, you know, I'm like, wow, I was affected. I was fascinated, but it was also comforting to see other folks coming to the same conclusion, because having these kinds of dreams, it's not unfair to question your sanity after. They're like, do other people fucking dream like this?
And I think that's probably why the person made the film, is
Yeah.
really like, this is a collective experience. Even though they're visualizing different things, this is how sleep paralysis manifests. It also, what I thought was most interesting is some of the folks went to doctors and therapists, and they were like, you're stressed, try to change your sleeping behaviors and sleeping hygiene. And to a certain extent that helps some people. This one poor guy, oh man, to me, he felt so alone in his experience. He had all the TVs.
Yeah.
And he kept
Yep.
adding TVs.
Yeah.
So he but like then he realized he had a problem and stopped with the TVs. One of the other interesting anecdotes was when that guy was sleeping with his friends. He was like, yeah, we're all in bed together, like two girls and a guy.
Yeah.
And he was seeing this like demon with red eyes telling him things. And she was dreaming about a black cat with red eyes staring at him, telling him things. And she woke up from a nightmare, and he was awoken from his sleep paralysis.
Yeah.
Which was crazy.
There's a lot to consider in, you know, the nature of shared experience and consciousness and suggestion in, you know, dreams are there. It's like it's a visual sticky paper, you know, anything flying by at the moment might stick to your dream and then be filtered through your sleeping mind, which is a little surreal, a little fucked up. It doesn't visualize things the way that your waking mind does. So out come your weird dreams. But this documentary was filmed so well and in such a interesting, engaging way that even as somebody who is a little unsure about the enjoyment factor of documentaries, I was wildly entertained by this.
And there wasn't any message either.
No,
it wasn't like, well, if you have sleep paralysis, go talk to your doctor. Or sleep paralysis is something that you can just deal with.
Interesting examination of this phenomenon. And like I said, yeah, you don't have to, it's a low stakes documentary. Like you don't have it in the back of your mind that there's like a murdered child in this, you know?
Also, it really shines a light on how little we know about the sleeping mind.
It's amazing.
Even people that participate in sleep studies, you can't recreate what is happening in your home.
The other thing,
you go to a place, you sleep, you have all these electrodes hooked up to you, and they study your brain activity.
I sleep like that anyway.
But they still can't really recreate the circumstances in which will cause you to have sleep paralysis episodes or to have lucid dreams. You can still only just study brain activity.
Well, it's
not
the
visuals.
paradox of observational study is if once the subject becomes aware that they're being watched, they alter their behavior. You can't observe them in their natural state. The other thing about this movie that really struck me was, you know, a lot of people will say that they're not creative, but geez, these people, the stuff that they dreamed was so creative, so interesting, and so wild that I guarantee at least some of these people in their daily lives don't think of themselves maybe as extra creative people, but I would argue that we all are, at least on a subconscious level.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's The Nightmare.
Oh, The Nightmare.
Why don't you talk about your final
I'm not
documentary you want to share
Well,
with the group?
It's really more part of a documentary. I'm not going to get into the whole thing because the whole thing isn't a horror documentary. It's really just this moment. And I mentioned him earlier. Hard to bring up documentaries without bringing up Werner Herzog, who is one of the greatest directors of all time and one of the greatest documentarians of all time. I am going to be discussing his 2005 documentary Grizzly Man, probably his most famous one, but also definitely check out My Best Fiend, his film about his relationship with Klaus Kinski, and Little Dieter Needs to Fly, which he then made into a film, Rescue Dawn, with Christian Bale.
And also check out Documentary Now, especially the one where they sort of mimic
where they
Werner
do
Herzog.
they do My Best Fiend.
Yeah,
is what they do. Is they do a version of My
with
Best
Alexander
Fiend.
Skarsgård and Bill Hader. Maybe
I'm not sure.
I don't remember.
I mean, Bill Hader and Fred Armisen were the guys that did
Documentary
the show.
Now.
So anyway, Grizzly Man. Just real quick, it's not a documentary that Werner Herzog filmed. It is largely him piecing together footage that the subject, Timothy Treadwell, filmed. He was a lover of bears who lived for many seasons amongst the bears, like literally with them, as like a bear kind of. It was a lot. So he ends up in Katmai National Park in Alaska. With grizzly bears. And listen, the thing that you were all waiting to happen happens. And that's the thing about Grizzly Man is this is a story everyone knew.
It's
everyone
not
knew
a horror documentary
No.
until it is.
Everyone knew what happened to Timothy Treadwell. Even people who didn't could kind of tell, okay, this movie's about a guy that lives with grizzly bears. It really only ends the one way. So throughout the film, there's a mounting sense of dread. The kind that is like, a bad thing's going to happen, but you don't know exactly when, and you don't know what it's going to be or what shape it's going to take. So at this time, we didn't know the final moments of Timothy Treadwell. Now, where this becomes, in my opinion, a horror documentary is towards the end of the film, the producer and friend of the late Timothy Treadwell gives him the audio recording of his death and his girlfriend's death. The camera was on at the time, but it had a cap on. So it did record audio of Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend's very long, very agonizing death by a grizzly. Now, they don't play a single second of it. You watch Werner Herzog put the headphones on, but the camera is from behind him. Really, you are watching the face of the producer, Timothy's friend, as she watches Werner Herzog. Now, Werner Herzog is a pretty intense guy, but as he's listening to this, you notice his hand starts to shake, and then you see the look on this woman's face as she is looking at his face, and he just takes it off and he says, "Have you listened to this?" And she says, "No." And he says, "You must never listen to it. You must destroy this. You must destroy this and never let anyone listen to it." And he doesn't put it in the movie. I will never forget that moment. I couldn't breathe. It was a moment where I realized I was so happy he didn't put it in the movie. And I also realized that I had been expecting him to do so. And that forced me to confront sort of an ugly, voyeuristic NASCAR side of myself of like, wait, was I watching this to hear a man die, like a real man die? And it was really a moment where Werner kind of, he doesn't say this, but he knows his audience and he knows the human condition, where he's like, I know that you want to hear this, but no one should hear this. Now, since then, in doing the research, no one has ever heard this because it was destroyed. It was never released. And in this day and age, it's pretty incredible. It's never leaked. There's no audio. But what there is are detailed descriptions of what is on the tape by people who have listened to it. So,
well, let's talk about Timothy Treadwell a little bit. He was an environmentalist. He was a documentary filmmaker that made a Among the Grizzlies documentary, and he was very interested in bear protection. He spent 13 summers living with grizzly bears.
Yes.
In the national park.
Yeah, he loved these animals. He envisioned a world where they were protected. He started a foundation,
They are
but
still wild animals.
he was not well, and he courted disaster. And I would not hold it against him so much if he didn't get his girlfriend killed, who very clearly did not want to be there and died while trying to rescue him.
Yeah.
So I hold him a little bit accountable for that. He's very clearly in the documentary a narcissist and someone who is not all there. And I think it was very easy, at least for me, to dismiss this man as like, well, fuck around, find out, right? But watching that scene, listen, I don't care. No one deserves to go that way. No one deserves that. And seeing a man like Werner Herzog, who has done things and seen things and has that kind of classic German, dark expression to him, see him so affected, it scared the shit out of me. Like, well, oh my God, if this is rocking Werner Herzog, then I never want to hear this. So that's why I include that moment from Grizzly Man.
This is what Werner Herzog says too. If you're purely after the facts, please buy yourself the phone directory of Manhattan. It has 4 million times correct facts, but it doesn't illuminate.
Yeah. God, I could listen to him say anything. I could watch any of his movies anytime. Werner, I hope you never die.
My last recommendation is a little out there. It's from 2020, and it's called The House in Between. It's directed by Steve Gonsalves, who is the host of Ghost Hunters and has been for the past couple of decades, and Kendall Welpton, who is a director and has directed shows and things like that. Not well known to me, but he is nevertheless a director. But it's about a woman named Alice who wakes up one night to loud noises and a bright light in her home in Mississippi. And she decides she's never going to sleep there. So she hires paranormal investigators and documentarians to basically give her house to them to try to uncover what's going on. So what's interesting about this is this film is laid out like a mystery that is being attempted to be solved. And they bring in all kinds of experts. I use in quotes because it really depends on what you think of experts. So paranormal investigators, people who have like scientific and engineering backgrounds who have created contraptions that like test levels of activity of different kinds. They set up cameras. They have psychics. They have mediums. They have all kinds.
Are you talking about like
come
Doctors
into the
Egon
house.
Spengler and Ray Stantz?
Not in that way, but in like electrode.
Yeah, like an EKG reader and a proton.
They have those.
A proton. Of course they do. Of course they do.
And
because
so
it's a very real thing that you should
want to further,
take seriously.
And this is part of it. They want to further the study of paranormal activity. They go to scientists, and the scientists are very like, it's not aliens.
Get out of my office.
But what was interesting to me is that, first of all, this house is said to be the most haunted house in America, and it's the only documented 10-year-long paranormal investigation. So Alice, I really appreciated her bravery, her open-mindedness of she's really trying to figure out what's going on with this house because it's something weird. What was most interesting to me is the local historians and some of the psychics and mediums that came felt certain things outside or had dreams of her property and would come with pictures of like her back door with a walking stick, of which Alice collected walking sticks, but the person had never known that. It wasn't something that was publicized. So there were like coincidences that were very strange and interesting. So that's one thing. But the most interesting thing was historically the property and what the property was used for. And it was very reminiscent to me of Poltergeist in the way that
You move the gravestones?
It's Mississippi. So we're talking about a place that is fraught with racial tensions. And it was once known that a very cruel man lived there and owned slaves, and there were probably hangings, and there were probably bodies buried on the property. When they ended up developing this land to then build homes on top of, those bodies were moved. When they brought cadaver dogs in, they could still sense the presence of decay.
Body juice.
So that was the most interesting to me because it was more of a tangible explanation that it's sour soil.
Yeah. I mean, listen, counterpoint, you dig anywhere in Mississippi, likely you are finding remnants of atrocity.
But when the psychics and mediums started to show up and they were separate, came at different times from different places in the country and would go outside of her home, they would feel something was off, something heavy.
If I took you to a house and told you nothing about it versus I took you to a house and spent an hour before telling you that it was the most haunted, fucked up place on earth, I don't know.
But like I said, they weren't feeling stuff inside the house. It was only on the property.
That was my next question. Since I have not heard of or seen this documentary, was this documentary full of footage of ghosts?
No.
Great.
But things would move inexplicably.
Sure. Inexplicably.
That was the most. But what I learned is paranormal investigations aren't like the movies.
Yeah.
They don't result in things like the movies. It is
like fighting Valak.
A door will open.
Yeah.
A cabinet will open. That's it.
Yes.
That's the extent of it.
I wonder why that is.
So, I think this is just interesting because of how it's laid out. It does creep you out a little bit. It leaves you to wonder, not if there are aliens or ghosts or what have you, but can a house that's built on sour land really be a creep factor?
Yeah.
And I think we have the answer.
And if you invite enough grifters into one place, how grift can you grift?
Well, like I said, she really kind of donated her house to science.
That's cool.
Ish.
Yeah.
What is this called? Pop science?
Pseudoscience?
Pseudoscience.
Yeah.
But the whole goal, and what I thought was really nice is some of the, local ghosty people, the people that were a little bit more local, really got to know Alice.
Yeah.
And really said, what do you want? And she said, I just want to live in my house. I just want to know that it's not something malevolent.
Honestly, in the end, it was the spirits we met along the way.
But she did. She ended up sleeping in the house. There is a part 2. I don't recommend.
There's a part 2?
It's just more of
the rise of Alice. Yeah, no, I'm sure it's...
Where's Alice?
Yeah.
Go ask Alice.
Listen, I'm sure anything hosted by the Ghost Hunters guy is top-notch crack investigative journalism. So horror documentaries, real quick. There's so many good ones out there. I kind of stayed away from a couple of really famous ones, but they're well worth watching. Definitely check out Cursed Films, Room 237, and Horror Noir. Those are some incredible documentaries. That's more like about horror movies.
Yeah.
We focused on horror documentaries about like subjects, but there's some really good explorations of horror movies and horror filmmaking. And if you really want to destroy your sense of like self and well-being and watch the most disturbing documentary I've ever seen in my life, you could always check out The Bridge. And that's all I'm going to say. Google it, The Bridge, and watch at your own peril.
Okay. Well, all of these, come with a warning.
It's horror.
But also, not to yuck anybody's yums, whatever you get excitement and whatever you want to buy into, we hope you enjoy one of these documentaries that we recommended.
And remember, it's all true. It really happens. So sleep tight.
Don't let those sleep terrors bite. Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our Octerrorfest theme and all other music was written and performed by David Suspanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you do, we promise not to haunt you.